Welcome to everybody here, and particularly to our panel, who I'll introduce shortly. So this is the first of the two getting published sessions that we're running as part of DSA's annual conference 2021. Somewhat differently to previously, we're having a series of events in the week leading up to the main conference to sort of thin things out and make people's screen time more bearable, I guess, and less concentrated. Let's see how that plays out as we go forward. One bit of housekeeping. You are welcome to contribute thoughts and questions via the chat function, but if you could do so via Zoom, please, rather than Hoover, that would be more helpful to the panel participants in particular. So chat in the Zoom interface, please, rather than Hoover. Okay, let me introduce our panel of journal editors who are going to talk you through the, I guess, some of the promising aspects of how to get your stuff published and the pitfalls of how to avoid rejection. I'm guessing most people here may be early careers researchers. If your bandwidth is up to it, please do show us your faces. It's a nicer form of interaction if we can see each other, so don't be shy. It'd be good to see you. Thank you. And it's a really important moment. This is taking me back, actually. My first journal publication was via a paper I gave at a DSA conference back in 2001 with the journal that Sam is now managing editor of in JID. So this is bringing it all flooding back, and I hope some of you who've maybe got a paper in this conference where that will be your segue through to journal publication as well. So it's great that we've got three journal editors here. In order of how they will present on the panel, we have Oliver Morrissey from the Journal of Development Studies. Oliver's been with JDS for more years, I think, than he'd care to share, but an awful long time, and can't be divorced from it, it seems. And then we'll have Sam Brazies, a relative newcomer to JID, I think. So that's great, but not a newcomer to getting published himself at all. So he'll bring in those perspectives. And Cheryl Doss, who's been at ODS, managing editor of ODS for several years, but not yet a lifetime, I think, Cheryl. So really looking forward to all of your perspectives. So what we're going to do is to invite all of the panelists to pass on some pearls of wisdom consecutively. We'll take all three, and then we'll open up for Q&A for the remainder of the session we have. So store up your questions if you want to give them verbally, but feel free to throw them in the chat as and when they arise, and I'll keep track of them and make sure our panelists are abreast of them when we come to the Q&A. Great, so over to you then, Oliver.
Right, well, I hope you're all enjoying what events in the conference you've been able to participate in so far. I'm just going to focus on two core issues. The first is that you have to convince the editor of the journal that your paper is worth sending for review. And you've got to do that in the introduction, and ideally just the first 2 pages of the introduction. And the second thing, which is related, that I'll talk about, is you need to think carefully about the suitability of your paper for the journal to which you're submitting it. So my experience is not limited to JDS, either as publisher, reviewer, or even as an editor. But I'll use that as my focal point for this. And I suppose the first thing to realize about JDS is we now get over 1,500 submissions a year. We publish about 150 papers a year. So that means that in a kind of steady state, 10% of submissions are likely to get published. Now, so you're fighting for scarce places. We now have 6 managing co-editors, And the paper that's submitted is going to be allocated to one of those, and you wouldn't know in advance who it is. You could make a judgment. If it's an economics paper, it's likely to go to one of the economists. If it's non-economics, it will go to one of the non-economists. Broadly speaking, about 2/3 of the papers published in JDS are economics. The remainder are not economics, or they might have economic elements, but they're not economics. Most of them are probably political science. They may be quantitative, they may not be. Those editors will desk reject, roughly speaking, 80% of submissions. So it's getting past the editor gatekeepers that's really crucial. Now, 80%, that might sound brutal, and in many respects it is brutal. And that means that they don't go to reviewers, but we have to do that, because even if you ignore that, that means that, roughly speaking, 300 papers are being sent out to review. So that means we're looking for 600 reviewers each year. And there's a limit to the reviewers you can get, the time they can allocate. So you can't send all of the papers out to reviewers. So a decision has to be made quite quickly as to, is this paper a runner? Will it fit the journal? Will it contribute? And the editors will make that decision normally just by reading the introduction. If the introduction is quite captivating, then they'll look through more of the paper. So what's important in the introduction? Well, first of all, place the paper in the context of the literature. What is the issue, the gap that you're addressing? How are you going to do it? What's the sample? What's the method? What's the approach? And then what are the core findings? What's the contribution? And is that contribution? And that contribution should be broader than just the particular sample or case study that you're analyzing. You have to try and speak to a broader literature. It might be a small comment on a broader literature, but it should speak more broadly if you want to get into a general, non-specialized journal. It's specialized in development studies, but it's still broad, and it's got a broad readership. So the editors are trying to think, okay, first of all, will this paper interest the readers? Secondly, is it likely to get past reviewers? So they will look to see, is it a good sample? Is it rigorous? Is it up to date in the methods? Is there an interesting contribution? So all of that, you want to try and make that clear in the first couple of pages of the introduction. So that's the most important part of what you write. It's also the last bit that you really write. You need to know exactly what you're concluding before you can package it and essentially sell it to the editor in the introduction. Then, assuming you get past that threshold, then it goes out to reviewers, and in the experience of JDS, roughly half the papers are rejected by the reviewers. So ultimately, perhaps 10%, sometimes even less, of submissions make it to a publication. Now, the second issue I was going to say is think about, is this paper appropriate to the journal? An obvious question to ask is, well, has that journal published related or similar papers recently, say over the last 5 years? If it hasn't, then that kind of suggests maybe maybe the journal isn't interested in this type of paper. That's not always the case. Sometimes there can be quite a novel angle in a paper, and a journal will think, yeah, actually, yeah, this is an opportunity to present that particular issue. So that does happen. That may particularly happen for review type papers, focused reviews that really they're difficult to write, but a good review can be quite appealing to a journal. And they might be a bit more flexible about that. Certainly in JDS, we'll often publish review papers on topics we don't cover frequently, precisely because it's an opportunity to say, you know, look, let's introduce our readers to what's happening in this area of the literature. And then, you know, so first of all, you've got to see, is this paper, are there related papers in the journal? And then are you citing them? Now, the prime reason for citing papers in the journal you're submitting to is to demonstrate, look, I'm aware of this journal. What I'm contributing adds to papers that you've published in this journal, may even challenge them, may even disagree with them. That's fine, as long as it's a rigorous, well-argued paper. And an incidental benefit that some journals put more emphasis on than others, of course, the journals like their impact factor to be improved. So they do like it if you're citing papers that have been published in the journal. But for JDS, it's not essential. But it's more important because it gives the signal that, look, I've looked at this journal, you've published related papers, so my paper is appropriate. Then you have to demonstrate, of course, that your paper is of a similar standard to those that have been published and is contributing and adding something to what they've done. Another thing to keep in mind, of course, is that if you cite papers from a journal or from anybody in your reference list is a potential referee of the paper. And if you're citing papers that have been published in the journal you're submitting to, well, there's a likelihood that the editor will be familiar with those authors and they might be the first port of call for reviewers. But it's not necessarily the case. They may already be reviewing papers, so they won't be available. They may have been asked recently, so you don't want to keep bothering the same people. But you know, the list of references is often the first place editors look when they're trying to think about, well, who might be suitable reviewers? Because if you're looking for 2 people to review a paper, you're ideally aiming to have a short list of about 6 that can be requested, because some will always say, sorry, I can't, or I won't. And you know, editors have accumulated their own networks and contacts, but they will be interested in looking at, well, who's been cited? Do I know these people? Are they good reviewers? Maybe I'll use them. But the crucial thing, and I'll end on this and pass on and you can ask questions, the crucial thing is you've got to sell your paper to the editor of the journal in the introduction. So you really need to pay attention to writing a very, very good introduction. And I'll pass on to Sam.
Great. I'll just briefly just to welcome everybody who's arrived recently. You've just caught hopefully a big enough chunk of Oliver Morris's inputs. Oliver's managing editor at Journal of Development Studies and a professor of economics at Nottingham. We're now going to pass on to Sam Brazes, who works at UCL Dublin and is University College Dublin, apologies. And at JID before Cheryl Doss, who works at Oxford. We'll talk about Oxford Development Studies, and I've posted something in the chat about the housekeeping in terms of where to put any chat in Zoom rather than Hoover, and please do put your camera on if your bandwidth will support it. It's a nicer form of engagement for all involved, but I'll be quiet again and pass back to Sam. All yours, and thank you, Oliver.
Great, thanks, Sam, and thanks to Oliver. You've highlighted a lot of what I was going to say, and you've been at it for a long time, so I'm glad to hear that the issues that I'm encountering in my much more limited experience are similar to what you've encountered. So I would just briefly maybe kind of highlight some of the points that you said. Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is, of course, the primary thing that's going to determine whether your paper is published or not is the substance, right? So if you have good work, that will get published. But I would say that that's a necessary and not sufficient condition. Right. So, what we're really talking about here is how do you make sure that your work, which is good, and your ideas that are good and interesting, get first past the editors, and then secondly, past the reviewers. So the first thing I would say, again, to echo Oliver, is fit. And I think, again, as Oliver suggests, that, looking at who you're citing and, who your paper is in conversation with, should really be a clue to you as, is this a good journal? So, of course, at JID, we love if you're talking to JID papers, but also, if you're not citing Journal of Development Studies, Review of Development Economics, world development, if you're focused mainly on, Journal of Agricultural Economics or something, right? That may be a signal to you that maybe my paper is a better fit to a more specialized audience, because again, JID would be very much a general interest development journal, where we're trying to reach a broad range of folks and backgrounds. So fit's really important. And again, we have sort of similar metrics, I think, in terms, I don't think we quite desk reject quite as high as JDS, but probably, more like 35 or 40%. But we also are ending up with about 10% of submissions ultimately published. So it is really a competitive space. The second thing, as Oliver says, you got to sell it, and I would call this the hook, and absolutely the introduction, and that's going to be very important for the editors. But I would say what's also really important to you is make sure that your abstract is super tight and has the hook, right? That, clearly shows, not only the editors who you're talking to and what the findings are, but that's the one piece that potential reviewers are going to see. And if there's anything that once you get past the editorial stage that's going to determine whether your paper gets published or not, it depends on who your reviewers are. And, there really is a reviewer lottery. And I think that, certainly all of my colleagues here, we try to get you as good of reviewers as we can, but there's a lot of strain on reviewers. There's a lot of reviewer fatigue. And if a reviewer, all they're seeing is the abstract, if they see an abstract that doesn't interest them, they're probably going to pass on reviewing that paper. And we're usually asking the folks that we think are going to be best first, right? Who we think, are, going to be most solidly placed in the literature or have the most experience. So you really want to get them as your reviewers. Even if it, you don't ultimately get accepted, they're going to give you the best comments, which you can then incorporate when you're looking to submit the paper somewhere else. So the way that you pull them in and convince them of the merit and importance of your paper is on the abstract. So I'd really spend time on your abstract, really focus on that, really make sure that that's saying what you want it to say. And then the last thing I'll just say briefly is, again, this is not a necessary condition, but, it's something that might tip the balance either at the editorial stage or at the reviewer stage, is your presentation. Take time to make sure that your paper looks good, right? So of course, check typos, all the rest of that. But, make sure that your tables are formatted nicely, right? Make sure that your figures are attractive. That's a lot of places where, people are going to get information. If reviewers open up a paper and there's messy tables with, a bunch of stars and lots of extra bars and, that's going to turn them off, right? So, make those visuals nice. And then also, I think importantly, whatever editorial management system you're submitting under, make sure that the proof looks good, right? So make sure that there aren't big, gaps of white space or that tables are spilling across pages. Again, that's not going to be, speak to the merit of your work. But when we're talking about the type of acceptance rates that we're talking about, that may be something that, just puts a, bad frame in a reviewer's mind, which may then, incline them to say, oh, this paper doesn't look as professional or as well executed. And those are easy and small things that you can address that, you really don't want to hinder or hold back your paper, and allows the reviewers and the editors to focus on your ideas and your contribution. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Cheryl.
Great, thank you. So I get the challenge of trying to say something a little bit different than what either of the two of them have said. So I'll make one kind of general comment along the lines, and then I've got a few of things not to do. So I think kind of to try to build on, say something a little different from them, one of the things that I'm always struck with as an editor is that people really struggle to figure out how to frame the contribution that they're making, right? I think Sam talked about putting your paper in conversation with other papers and citing the other relevant literature, but really to think about what it is that's your contribution. And we get a number of economics papers that say things like, nobody has ever regressed X on Y before. And so that's my new contribution, right? Unless you can really tell us why regressing X on Y is useful or relevant or helps us to understand a bigger issue, that's not particularly useful. Or nobody's ever looked at this particular issue in my country, right? And just doing it in another country is not really a contribution. You need to think about why somebody who really doesn't care about the particular case that you're writing about would be interested in reading your paper, right? So somebody who's working on something on a different conflict in a different part of the world, why might they learn something from reading your paper? And think about how that is the contribution, right? Make it, particularly for any of the development studies, to make journals, to make it a broader contribution that somebody would want to read, right? People talked about the abstracts, right? If the editor is not interested by the time they've read your abstract and the first page, it's not going to fly. You've got to have us want to be reading the paper and be excited about what you're doing. So then let me say a few kind of much smaller tips. One is that the editor should not be the first person to read your paper. You ought to have had a number of other people read your paper. You ought to, hopefully many of you are presenting these papers at conferences so that you've presented the ideas, gotten feedback on what you're doing. But in terms of whether the paper is clear, whether it says what you want it to say, did you leave half the information still in your head and not actually put it on paper? You want other people to have read and given you comments on your paper long before you send it to an editor. I think for early career researchers, really one of the challenges is going from a thesis to papers, particularly those of you who are writing kind of manuscript kind of theses rather than the 3 paper versions of it, but really figuring out how you can take your ideas and choose one idea, one key point, and write a paper out of that. Not try to write. So I deal with this with my master's students all the time. They want to take their 30,000 word master's thesis and just shorten it, push it all in and just make it a little bit shorter, down to 8,000 words. And that never works. You've got to really pick out a particular story and figure out how to frame it for a journal article. And you're going to leave out a lot of stuff. You will have done a lot of really interesting things that are not going to go in the journal article. And maybe they'll go somewhere else, but don't try to put everything in. We all get our papers rejected. So when you get rejected, that puts you in the category with all of the rest of us who've ever published. So figure out what kinds of comments you've got and what you need to do to change the paper before you send it. Do you just need to send it somewhere else? Did you send it to the wrong journal, or are there some real fundamental things that you need to address first? And if you get a revise and resubmit, or even some of the journals call them a reject and resubmit, that's great, right? Oliver was saying that they desk reject 80%. So if you get somebody saying revise it, take those revisions seriously, talk to somebody about what you're doing and how to revise it. But that's great news. I always get people coming and being really discouraged at that point, but that's a good first outcome. I would add on the citations that, right, thinking about who you're citing and the point that, right, often the people you're citing may be asked to be reviewers. One of the things that means is that they know the papers that you're citing. So cite them correctly. When I read a paper and it cited me wrong, that really turns me off, right? If they cite the wrong paper, if they say I said something, I do a lot of stuff on agriculture, and I had one recently where they cited my paper that was talking about this great point I made on livestock, and there is absolutely nothing about livestock in the paper that they cited. I suggest that they either are just being really sloppy or they haven't actually read it. Often you get things where people have clearly not actually read the paper themselves, but are just referring, thinking they've heard what somebody else was going to say about it. So when you cite my colleagues and co-authors completely wrong, that will make me think that you're being sloppy on it, right? I think all of us who review feel that way. So don't be sloppy on your citations. And my last piece of advice is that if you're asked to review papers, to take that opportunity. It's a great way, particularly for early career scholars, to look at this from the other perspective and try to think about what people need to do. You shouldn't feel like you're not in a position to do that. When, as editors, when we ask you to do it, we generally know who you are. And we're gonna look at your comments differently than we might look at somebody who's been in the field and publishing for 30 years. But often you're really embedded in the literature. And I know we often will send it to both some early career scholars as well as some much more established ones. So I would just encourage you to do that. You could offer to do that with some journals, but get some experience looking at it the other way. And I will stop there.
Fantastic. Great job, Cheryl. Not easy, as you said, to go after two very extensive rounds from Sam and Oliver, but you definitely brought some new things to the table there as well, so thank you. Okay, so the floor is open for questions. You're welcome to either put your hand up, your electronic hand, and I'll come to you in order, or you can post it in the chat. But it's over to you now. This is a great chance to dig a bit deeper behind some of those bits of advice and ask questions that you're currently wrestling with in your bid to get published and get your work out there. So who wants to start things off? Faria.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
That's good.
Okay, I have a question that, for example, if our paper has been rejected by a particular journal, so can we incorporate the suggestions of the editors and then resubmit our paper to that same journal?
Not usually, not unless say the rejection had a statement like, if you're able to, address these issues, perhaps with additional data or something like that, we may reconsider it. But in general, if it's a reject from one journal, that's a reject from that journal. The one other thing I would add to the very helpful comments Cheryl gave on this is, if you get to a situation where you get comments and you're asked to revise, it's important that you do address all of the comments. Okay. If you can't revise, if you can't incorporate some comments, at least explain why you can't. And then the other thing is, if you are rejected after you've got referees reports and you are rejected, before you submit to another journal, make sure you revise the paper and incorporate as many of the comments as you can, both because that will improve the paper, but also you could get the same referees again. It's not unusual. I've once received the same paper 3 times as it went through different journals. Now, it eventually found the right journal. But one of the first things I did was check, well, have they incorporated comments that I made previously? And if they have, if a paper hasn't, I'll just send my original report and say reject. And I've come across reviewers who would do the same. So, if you get to the situation where you get comments and you're rejected, incorporate the comments, improve the paper, and then try the next journal.
Thank you so much for your valuable feedback. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Faria. And do we have any more questions? I think there's also a time concern there. Don't waste your time. going back to the same journal, it could take 2 months to get exactly the same response, and you've lost all that time. So take the first no seriously. Who else has a question for our panel?
Hi, I have the impression that from what you said, development journals have a preference for economics paper. So as an anthropologist and someone who does qualitative research, I wonder if there's any particular advice that you would consider?
Was that to a particular editor? Sam wants to come back.
No.
Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, no, I would say, I mean, certainly, I won't speak for the colleagues here, but JID, we very much strive to be a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary development journal. So one of our 4 co-editors is an anthropologist by training, and we're very open both to methodological and field diversity. So yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it is true. I mean, I would say the bulk of our submissions are either economics or are quantitatively based, but we certainly welcome submissions for that. And it's a good thing. We're just in the process. We had an editorial transition at JID about 6 months ago, and we're going to have a new welcome from the editors coming out, I think, in our next issue. But do look at the journal description and the about the journal, and that's a good place to check also for fit, right? And I think that most journals are going to be pretty explicit on their webpage about, this is who we're inviting, this is who we're welcoming. And also, you can take a look at sort of recently published articles in that journal, to just sort of get a sense of what kind of articles are being published.
I would just add for ODS, we publish quite a bit that's not economics, and are quite open to things. You have to be careful with any of the whatever discipline you're in, that you're writing from anthropology to a development studies audience, right? That you're not just engaging in some of the narrow disciplinary kinds of debates, but that what you're writing would be accessible and interesting to a broader audience. But certainly it's probably easier in some ways to do that from anthropology than from economics. Although you can also not do it in anthropology. You can write really narrow things there too. So I think for all of them, thinking about, right, who the audience is that's going to be reading it. And that flips around too. You want to think about, as you're writing it, what kind of an audience are you writing a particular paper for? Do you want to be writing it for a development studies audience, or do you want to be writing it for a more disciplinary audience?
Yeah, I think I'd just add the same. It's not just anthropology, but anthropology is a good example of an area in development studies where, certainly in JDS, we would feel we publish fewer anthropology papers than we would like to. But that's just because we're not getting the right type of anthropology papers submitted. Now, none of the managing co-editors are anthropologists, but we do have anthropologists on the editorial board. So, we do have people that we can refer to. But again, if it was anthropology, it would have to be speaking more broadly. Otherwise, we would say, well, look, I think this is better suited for an anthropology journal. And that's just a difficult judgment. I can see that from economics papers. So, the big difference between, say, JDS and Journal of Development Economics, for example, in terms of the attitude towards papers, is that the Journal of Development Economics will be super sensitive about, are you getting this particular technical aspect of the theory or the econometrics correct? And if you're not nailing down this really technical issue, they're not interested. We're a bit more flexible. As long as you explain that, look, we've done what's feasible and what's practical with the data, we've got an interesting contribution, it has a broader appeal than just, well, my econometrics is more complicated than your econometrics, which is sometimes what some economics papers feel like. That's not what we're interested in. We want to know, is your story, what's the story? And can you validate your story? And is that story interesting?
one of the comments I often make to authors of economics papers is that it would be, what they're sending us would be much better suited to an economics journal. It's asking a narrow economics question rather than a broader development studies question.
I think it comes to something that Cheryl said earlier, having that discussion with your supervisor, mentor. You know, you're going to be working on 2 or 3 papers at any one time, most likely at this stage, coming out of the PhD, the postdoc, whatever, working out which ones are for the disciplinary journals, which ones are going to hit a development studies audience, that maybe the rigor maybe not be as strong, but you've got important things for the field. So some early discussions. We have a question in the chat from Mackenzie. How do you decide to keep working on a paper that's been rejected or to just bin it? And this maybe comes to the strategy that you're using. I was told early on, you aim for the top journals, and then you come down, and then you come down, and so on. And that might be the type of advice you've had. I'm not sure if our editors can speak to that overall strategy, but also Mackenzie's specific question about when is the advice so stern about the rejection that you should just move on?
I suppose from my experience and that of my PhD students in particular, rather than from the journal perspective, I think initially aim for the best paper, the best journal you think you can get that paper into, but be realistic. You know, it has to fit with the types of papers you've seen in the journal. If it gets rejected, sometimes it might get rejected and they may give suggestions. The editor may say, I actually think this paper will be better suited for X, Y, or Z. And that gives you a guide to where you can go. I think there comes a point, if it keeps getting rejected, well, you've got to ask a serious question of why. And ideally you have some colleagues, senior colleagues at that stage that you can talk to and get advice. But I would recommend against giving up completely, because there must be merit in it, particularly if it's got to the journals and got reviewed. Then that's a signal that, well, you know, basically you've hit the top third or even top 20%. So you're getting there. You just haven't found the right journal. And there comes a point where it's probably better to get a publication than to keep, so maybe go down to, you know, a credible, but still, you know, what you might feel is, well, actually this journal is lower level than I really think this paper is worth, or this paper deserves. But if you've been rejected a number of times, there comes a point where actually just getting a publication could be good for you. And having a paper published can then make the next one easier. So, you know, I would never give up completely unless you're continuously getting desk rejected.
I think sometimes the reason it gets rejected over and over again is because whatever kind of data that you have, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, really can't answer the question that you're trying to answer, right? And so no amount of rewriting the paper or reanalyzing it is going to allow you to answer the question that you had set out to answer. That's a good point to know. The question then of what to do next might be, is there a somewhat different paper you could write with the data that you have? And I see this sometimes with people with really small quantitative samples where they're trying to do something. And you say, well, the data isn't strong enough to answer that question, but maybe do you have qualitative data as well? Are there other things that you could bring in? Could you change the focus of the paper somewhat? And so there may still be a paper in there that's really interesting, but it may not be the one that you started out with. So the question may not be, do you keep working on it kind of on that trajectory and make it better, or bin it? But there might be, is there some other different kind of direction that you could take this paper where you really could answer the question you were trying to ask and make a contribution?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and maybe I'll just add a little bit also to the strategy as someone who's had plenty of papers rejected and plenty of papers that have been rejected multiple times. Um, I mean, there really is a lot of, I mean, I think there's a lot of randomness in the review process, right? So at any particular journal for any particular submission, it's really going to depend on the reviewers you draw. And I mean, as editors, we can try to look through that, and if I get a really nasty review that I don't think is reflective of the paper, maybe I'll send the paper to a third reviewer or something. But at the same time, because of the submission load that we get, almost always, if there are mixed reviews, it's going to be reject just because we get enough papers, where we only can accept those that, are positive from multiple reviewers. So if you're getting rejects where there are mixed reviews, where one of the reviewers is saying, I really like this, and, there are good things, I would just keep trying. And, I think you can think about levels, of journals, right? And you don't necessarily need to drop down immediately. So if you send something to JID and you get a mixed review from us, and we reject, right? Then, send to JDS or send to ODS, because, clearly that paper's, it's past that first initial editorial hurdle. It's gotten, at least one positive reviewer. You're in the ballpark, right? And I'd stay in that ballpark and sort of exhaust the journals at that level, and maybe you get lucky in the draw. I think, the only time, again, where I would give up on it, as Oliver, I think, alluded to, is, if you really are getting desk rejected again and again and again, that might be the time to talk to a senior colleague and say, listen, what's going on here, and, be prepared for some honest feedback from that senior colleague. And they may just say, listen, this paper's just not going to be a runner for whatever reason. Or, again, maybe, as Oliver said, maybe you kind of go to a different tier of journal that's still credible, but, is maybe going to be, more open to the paper. So, really, it depends on the kind of feedback you're getting, I think, as to what to do with the paper. And, there have been papers that I've had rejected where I've then submitted to, quote unquote, better journal afterwards, after, taking some good reviewer comments and incorporating those, and had it published at the better journal, right? So, I don't think you necessarily always need to, go down, as it were, just try to get a sense of, what the feedback is telling you between the lines.
Great stuff. Hopefully that sorts your dilemma, Mackenzie. Who else has a question on their publishing strategy? I had one, if there's a gap. One thing I've noticed in the last decade or so is that journals are, and maybe this is more US-based journals, are getting a little bit tighter on methodology. And this is partly in terms of, world development, and US political science journals and so on. And they're emphasizing the importance of a very rigorous methodology, whether it's quant or qual, more so than they were, say, a decade ago. Is that, do you think, the same across the journals that you represent and are familiar with from UK European development studies, or is that a bit more particular? And should our cohort of early career researchers be really worried about that section of their paper in order to get accepted, and going back a few stages of their research design?
There's a number of elements there. Perhaps the one difference with all three of the journals we're representing is that because they are interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, can vary as to which they are, and are trying to appeal to a broader development studies, they can, as long as the methods are careful, appropriate, and rigorous, then we're probably likely to be a bit more flexible than some of the North American journals would be, certainly in economics, and also kind of quantitative political science, where in North America, if you don't have an utterly convincing identification strategy, they're not interested. Now, we're willing to be a bit more accommodating of that, as long as you've made a reasonably good attempt and you've demonstrated why it's not practical, but that they're still, valid conclusions. A lot of it comes down to, it's partly the kind of luck of the draw, as Sam said. It's partly how you package, and in particular, Cheryl's point, think carefully about what question you can answer. And maybe there comes a time when you change the question rather than changing the paper. I often find that it's only around the third version of a paper that I've suddenly worked out, oh, actually, no, that's what I've answered.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, listen, at JID and from a JID perspective, I mean, of course, we like papers with great data and good causal identification strategies. That's good and fantastic. And, we certainly encourage rigor when rigor is applicable. But I think also to Oliver's point, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things that we still might gain knowledge on that can't necessarily be neatly causally identified. But I think what's important is that, as an author, you are honest and forthright about what it is your paper can do with the data that it has, right? So, don't make causal claims with a cross-section regression of X on Y. I mean, there may still be something interesting that we get from that, but I think this also goes to Cheryl's point, right? I mean, I'm not just we won't necessarily, just reject a, cross-sectional X on Y regression out of hand if it's telling us something interesting, right? If there is something interesting about that, that we learn. So I think that's kind of where we would be at with that. And, it's not that we're hostile to identification strategies, because we're not. We like those. But I think we also recognize at the journal that there are lots of interesting things that we can learn, even if you aren't able to randomize, your selection of treatment and everything else, right? So, yeah.
Great, thanks. Carolyn has a question, and there's also one in the chat. Let's come to Carolyn first and then the chat. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for all these wonderful tips. It's really helpful. I just have a question. I'm a little bit confused as to what to do. So my situation is I've received a revise and resubmit, and from two very different referees, I would say. So the one really liked it, I think, and just had one or two minor things, and the other one, yeah, it was very, very severe. No, but helpful. So I took a long time to really try to address everything and rephrase my argument and theoretical contribution and along the lines of what the second referee asked for. And I sent it back. And now I've gotten it back again a couple months later with, again, extremely substantial comments by the one referee saying it hasn't improved and it still, makes no sense, and a lot of comments. And the other one says it reads very nicely now. And it's, and also there are certain points where both referees specifically sort of have completely different opinions on. So the one with only minor comments asked me to change the title to be a bit more on point, which I did. And then the other referee then in the second round said, I hate this, this throws me off completely. And so I'm just a bit not sure how to manage the situation. I'm a bit confused as to how to go about this, and what can I do to actually, satisfy both referees.
Cheryl, should we come to you? This is certainly something the editors should have guided on, surely.
I was going to say, I would answer this question from both sides, which is that I currently have a paper which has gotten, we're now in the third revision of it, with no guidance from the editor about how to respond to a reviewer who says completely different things each time they've reviewed it. One reviewer really likes it, and the other one says, they've said do X, and then the next time have said do Y, and we've gotten no guidance from the editor. That's the editor's job, is to give you some guidance on what to do. I think sometimes as editors, we do it better than others. And some associate editors will do better jobs of really kind of saying, pay attention to this and not this. But that is the editor's job. And I think if you're in a situation like the one you're in, you can write to the editor and say, could I have some guidance on what to do? It should be the editor who's making the decision in the end, not the reviewer. The reviewers are supposed to be, at least this is my understanding of the roles, that the reviewers are providing guidance and advice to the editor, but the editor should be deciding. So I think it's appropriate. You can go to the editor and ask them. Now, there are bad editors out there, none of us obviously on this panel of that category, who won't give you that kind of advice. And you get better advice the higher the journal is, right? The better the quality of the journal, the better reviews you get, and the better guidance you often get from the editor. But I think you can go back to the editor and say, I'm trying, what are the pieces? How do I've just been told to do two completely different things. Can you give me some suggestions on what you're looking for? And then the other thing is to go to your mentors and have them talk you through it as well. They may have some good advice on that specific issue.
Thanks, Cheryl. We've got about 5 minutes left and 2 questions. Probably got time for one more if someone wants to pop it in the chat.
Just to add to Cheryl's, that in a case like that, do write to the editor, but write it as nicely as you can. You kind of lay out, look, these 2 reviewers obviously disagree, and there seems to be no way I can make both of them happy. Now, I've clearly made one of them happy, but the other is now objecting to changes I've made to satisfy one. So it's very difficult for me to judge. Could you give me some guidance? And, some editors are better than others, but it is the editor's job. But you don't say to them, it's your job to do it.
Thank you very much.
Good.
And don't tell them that they're wrong. That's usually a bad strategy.
No.
I'm never very happy when authors write and tell me that I'm wrong in my decision or the way that I'm looking at it. So
Sure, noted. Thank you.
Great, thanks all. Can we come to Sarabi's question in the chat? Are there any particular tips for scholars from the Global South who constitute, I think, over half of DSA membership at the moment, for getting their papers published in top-ranking journals?
I think 2 general comments. One, which we try to be aware of, is that most, not all, but most authors submitting from the South are in a weaker supportive environment than most of those who are submitting, from the North, so to speak. They don't have the same number of senior colleagues, or they don't have a seminar environment, so they don't have exposure to as much. And that relates to my second point, is that you probably need to pay even more attention to how you write the paper. Like all of the type of things that Sam said about making sure it's presented well, really getting a tight abstract, a good introduction. If relevant, pay attention to the English. We try to allow for that, but it alters the impression. If it's not well written, it won't be well received. So, do all of those things you can to present it as well as you can. And if the substance is there, and if you're clear on the contribution, you'll be given a chance.
Go ahead, Sam.
Just add if I can. I think to Cheryl's earlier point in her introduction, we get a lot of good and very technically proficient papers from contributors in the Global South about this thing in their country. And a lot of times that's fantastic, and there's access to data that other folks don't have data of. But in that instance, you really need to explain for a general interest journal like JID, this is a case of what, right? Or this is why investigating this in my country here is going to be of interest to folks outside of my country. And I think that might be one of the biggest hurdles we get. And, it's a lot of times those are papers that we want to get out there because they have some access to some really great data or some really great insights, but they just aren't going to speak to a broad enough audience as written.
I will say we sometimes with some of those, particularly in that kind of a case, will not send it out for review and immediately send it back to the author and say, there's something here, but it's not there yet. Go figure it out. These are some ways you want to take it. Invite them to send it back in before we would send it out for review. So that when we see those things that are, somebody's got a really interesting question and they just haven't quite gotten there yet, or they haven't framed it in a way that's relevant, we've sometimes invited them to do that. I'll add to the question in the chat, the question about multiple authors. I don't think that in terms of simply whether you have multiple authors or a single author, we don't look at that particularly when we're making a decision about a paper. So no, in that sense. Sometimes having multiple authors means that it's better. You've gotten a lot of feedback within your team. And so that can be good. Sometimes it gets written with completely different voices and you can hear this chunk was written by this person and this other chunk was written by somebody else. And that's a real disadvantage. You need it to come through in one voice. So maybe that means having one of the authors really put it in their voice a bit more, but there shouldn't be any real reason in terms of just whether or not it's one or multiple authors of it getting accepted.
Great. Okay. So thanks to our panel, we are out of time now, at least in terms of journal publication. So yes, I agree with the applause. Thanks, Josephine. Great advice from our editors. I wish I would have had this back in the early days when I was starting off. It would have been very helpful. And we have another session though, starting in 15 minutes, which is going to take you through the do's and don'ts of getting books published. And I would encourage you, some of you may be having this dilemma, what to do with the PhD, articles versus the book, or articles and book. Some of you may only come to the book question further down the line, but it's worth sticking around for. There is a different discipline involved, different things to think about. So even if it's not the most pressing thing in front of you for your career, it may be before too long. So stick around for that session, which will start in 15 minutes, and you don't even need to leave. It's the same Zoom link, same Zoom room. So feel free to switch off your camera and switch back on again at 2:15. That's great. So many thanks again, Cheryl, Sam and Oliver, and I'm sure they'll be looking forward to seeing a whole new set of submissions from your newly informed ECRs here. So thanks again.
Okay.